Welcome to the show, Valerio and Alessio. So it's great to have you both on. Thanks a lot for coming on. So our first question to start off with is a bit of a backdrop question about Italian politics. So Italian politics has often been characterized as having incredibly high levels of electoral volatility. Italy has had something like an astonishing 67 governments in the post-World War II period since 1945. Why then has Italian politics tended to be so volatile?
First of all, thank you, James, for hosting us. As concern your question, I would say it is mainly related to the kind of electoral system, Italian electoral system, which is mostly proportional. So, for example, right now in Italy, according to the latest polls, we have, for instance, small parties like Italia Viva, which was established a few months ago by Renzi. It was in the Partito Democratico earlier, which is polling around more or less 3%. So it's uncertain if we'll be able to pass the threshold. The same goes for other parties like the party established by Carlo Calenda, which is named Azione, also polling a bit more than 3%. So these kind of parties, when they are into coalition, let's forecast, for example, on center-left coalition with the Partito Democratico and Movimento 5 Stelle, you can imagine the possible role of the party of Renzi or Calenda within this coalition will make the overall stability, very precarious. As you said, a lot of volatility. And unfortunately, this has always been the case for Italy.
Right. So, first of all, thank you for having me here. And I would like to agree with Valerio here. Of course, when you're talking about crisis of governability, like when we see this astonishing high number of 67 governments since the 1945, of course, it's not always just one explanatory factor that determine this kind of phenomenon. We have to take into consideration several elements, like as Valerio said, the kind of electoral law, which I think for historical reasons, since the Constituent Assembly, they wanted to avoid that one party or one leader might become too powerful because of the previous Italian dictatorship experience. Also, the type of constitution that we have, a presidential republic, of course, would be more stable than a parliamentary republic, and the type, of course, of party system. There are many political parties representing many different ideologies, so we have a multi-party system and not have two-party system like those seen in UK and USA. Of course, there are also social, economical, cultural factors that determine this kind of phenomenon. But if we just combine these kind of elements, of course, according to Italian constitution, the Italian electorate does not elect the government, but the members of parliament. Eventually, by having a proportional or a mixed majoritarian electoral system, many parties win seats in Italian parliament. And unfortunately, or hopefully, according to the kind of perspective, no single party and not even a coalition usually manage to gain enough seats to govern until the natural end of the parliament. Instead, what usually happens is that Italy has been ruled by grand coalitions, and these grand coalitions are usually formed by parties belonging across all the political spectrum from left to right, which after election day, they can decide to form a new government with the political forces that have just been elected. And since parties will typically hold very different views, it's not hard to see why such coalitions often have many difficulties in agreeing on legislation or about the political agenda of the government. So eventually, these disagreements often end up in crisis, I would say.
Thanks a lot, Alessio, and also Valerio for your answers to the first question. Just very briefly, I think it's really interesting you mentioned, both of you, about the multi-party system, the grand coalitions, this wider complexity, and it makes me think about other countries in Western Europe, such as the Netherlands or even Belgium, where there are these coalition governments comprised of many different types of political parties. and also, again, very widespread patterns of electoral volatility when we see the fragmentation and how many different parties there are in the Netherlands. So for UK viewers listening to this episode, this is probably something that you might not be so used to kind of dealing with, in terms of the fact of tending to have a two-party system with the Conservatives or Labour, particularly in the Westminster government there. Of course, devolution in Britain, particularly in Scotland, for example, has kind of changed some of these traditional patterns. But it's very, very interesting for our UK viewers to hear a bit more about that. So moving on then to kind of the main focus of our episode when we're looking at populism, I think myself and also viewers who will be listening to this episode will have heard a lot about, the rise of the five-star movement, and also about the League. What exactly are these different types of parties, and also the other party, Fratelli d'Italia, led by Giorgia Meloni, more on the populist radical right. So what then is the meaning of populism in the Italian political context?
So I think that Italian populism does reflect the well-known definition made by Casmude, which is the thin ideology by stating that society is divided into these two antithetic groups. On the one hand, the pure people against the corrupted elite. Indeed, when recent literature on populism seek to create a common denominator in order to identify populist parties, tend to label as populist all those parties that usually position towards the poles of the left-right political spectrum. Hence, we are going to talk about radical parties, which are usually identified as populist and mostly radical right-wing parties. However, I know that you mentioned Five-Star Movement, the League, and Brothers of Italy as populist parties, but when we're addressing the Italian political context, I think it might not so easy to distinguish which party is populist and which party is not. Because not only the radical parties, but also mainstream or established parties have experienced at least once in their political life populist characteristics. And of course, I'm referring to Silvio Berlusconi's era with Forza Italia since 1993, or even so from the right wing and also from the mainstream left wing with Matteo Renzi leadership within Partito Democratico from 2010 until 2019, when since he funded Italia Viva. So I think that these two kind of examples can be defined as a sort of top-down populism. I mean, a kind of populism which is supported by the people, of course, and it claims to represent the people, the will of the people, but originated over a top-down mobilization. On the other hand, when we explore the radical parties, we can definitely identify as populist the Five-Star Movement and Brothers of Italy and the League. And in all these parties, I think that the common denominator among them is the bottom-up building process that these parties experienced. However, I think that these parties also show some differences, especially between the Five-Star Movements and the other two radical right parties. On the one hand, I think that the Five-Star Movement embraces populism more like as an ideology. In a sense that the raison d'etre of this party is to fight any established institution, or more in general, the corrupted political elite from the local, national to the supranational level. On the other hand, Brothers of Italy and League, I think that they embrace populism more like a communicative style rather than as an ideology, because I think that their ideology is already well defined around concepts of nativism and authoritarianism.
I agree with the points that Alessio was mentioned. It's not easy at all to distinguish about the variety of populisms in Italy. There are really different kinds. Radical right populist parties as Lega, Fratelli d'Italia, which has completely reversed right now the power position with Forza Italia. Right now, the party of Meloni is polling at around 15–16%, while Berlusconi's party, Forza Italia, is around at 6%. And let me, for example, let's take the referendum that will be held in Italy on the 20th and 21st of September, which is about the possibility to cut almost 1/3 of the members of the Italian parliament. And it's quite, you know, astonishing to me that, of course, there are parties like Movimento 5 Stelle, party like the Lega, which are, you know, in favor of cutting the member of the parliaments. What strikes me on the other hand is that other parties like Partito Democratico or former member of this party like Enrico Letta, which is a former Italian president of the Council of the Ministers, they are in favor as well of cutting, you know, the member of the parliaments. So you may ask why the PD, which is notoriously not a populist party, is in favor, you know, which are the reasons behind, you know, being in favor of such a populist move? Because according to most of the analysts, this is just, you know, frustration towards the elites, towards the political elites, to punish them, to cut them of 1/3. But according to me, behind this move from the Partito Democratico, for example, from Enrico Letta, there are also other kind of, you know, strategies, I would say. And as Alessio was mentioning, I would say a top-down approach to politics. Recently, Enrico Letta he wrote a tweet where he said, "The less parliaments we have, probably the better the quality will be." Which honestly, I don't see the logic behind this, you know, this statement, unless you prefer to have an approach to politics, which is a top-down approach. Let's call it based on expertise. Let's call it even technocratic. So I would say it's possible to mention that populist parties in Italy, but also other kind of movements, let's call them more technocratic, they are against party politics. They are in favor of for different reasons, of course, to cutting the number of the overall number of members of the Italian parliaments, but for different reasons. So which makes, you know, everything much more complicated. But we have to distinguish between this top-down approach to politics and this bottom-up approach. And again, I agree with Alessio just said, it's really complicated to see all the variety, distinguish all the variety of populisms in Italy right now.
Thanks a lot, both, for those fascinating answers to that question. I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper and ask you both about what do you think will be the likely result for the outcome for the constitutional referendum?
So I think that the result of the constitutional referendum would be that it will pass. There is a wide consensus regarding this referendum. Actually, it is an historical and ideological political fight in Italy. It was argued since many years, the goal to cut the number of members of parliament. And of course, I think that this referendum is clearly a product of Italian populism, by the way. Indeed, this referendum was an initiative of the Five-Star Movement, which goal was to fight the caste identified by the parliament and the privileges of the members of parliament. And of course, the main goal of this party since 2013 is, and I quote, to open the parliament like a can of tuna, all right? So there is a great consensus from the electorate to support this referendum. Not only the Five-Star Movement, but also the Democratic Party is supporting this referendum. So all the government is supporting it, but not only the majority, but also the opposition from the right-wing coalition is supporting this referendum.
I agree with Alessio. It's quite likely, even more. It's very likely that the referendum will pass. According to the latest poll that were available till the 2, if I'm not mistaken, the 2 of September, like 70% of the people would vote in favor of the cutting the Italian parliament, the member of the parliament. for example, I want to mention that today there was an interesting article about Roberto Saviano, which is an important intellectual leading writer. He wrote a few years ago a bestseller book, Gomorrah. He has always been a champion of the center-left of the Partito Democratico. However, there was, like a quarrel between Saviano and the establishment of the Partito Democratico, with Roberto Saviano heavily criticizing, for example, Zingaretti or Franceschini or other leaders of the PD, because they were following, the Movimento 5 Stelle and the other party of the opposition in this populist, move to cut, to reduce the number of the MPs in Italy. And it's awkward because this establishment of the Partito Democratico, they reply to Saviano, it's like, you don't see our strategy. We have always been, defending you from, the attack of Salvini, of Meloni, but this time really you don't see our reasoning. But honestly, in this case, like Saviano, I really don't see the reasoning why the PD is following, the Movimento 5 Stelle on this strategy.
Thanks a lot for that analysis. So Alessio, you just mentioned Cas Muda a few moments ago about this kind of definition of, probably the most widely accepted definition of populism that's out there. And so this actually got me thinking about a Twitter exchange that I saw yesterday taking place. So just for those viewers who are tuning into this episode, we recorded this on the 11th of September. So that Twitter exchange was yesterday on the 10th of September. And this is a Twitter exchange between Valerio and also Cas Muda. And so I saw that Valerio, you had a very interesting Twitter exchange yesterday with Cas Muda. And you were kind of discussing the mainstreaming of the far right and also the weakness of the mainstream. And what struck me, Valerio, is you mentioned that the center-left Democratic Party has kind of adapted to several five-star movement positions. And then last time, in contrast, you kind of mentioned that it was the five-star movement also adapting to Lega, to the League. And so I found that very interesting overall. Do you kind of want to say anything, either of you, really briefly about this point?
So, sorry, go ahead, Valerio.
Yeah, I would say it's very interesting because in the former, let's say, coalition government, which is more like named as a contract between the Lega of the Movimento 5 Stelle, all the favors, let's say, were with the Movimento 5 Stelle, but in a few months, the Lega and the ability of Salvini was really able to cannibalize, to completely jeopardize the Movimento 5 Stelle with politics against the illegal immigration to Italy and on several dossiers. So it's just before the pandemics, the Movimento 5 Stelle, also with the change of the leadership, with Di Maio leaving the secretariat, this role of leader of the Movimento 5 Stelle, was really, in a negative, moment for the five-star movements. So it comes a little bit as a surprise, first of all, that the Partito Democratico decided to agree to stay with the Movimento 5 Stelle. Of course, there are electoral reasons before this decision. However, I really don't see why all this necessity to adapt, to follow the Movimento 5 Stelle in a domain which is really not within the overall scope of the Partito Democratico. Why this decision to follow the Movimento 5 Stelle in this populist, domain, uncertain area, unless we really have as Alessio was mentioning at the beginning of the interview, a cultural and like sociological reasoning. It's really the Italian electorate moving towards more radical kind of populism. Otherwise, it's not really easy to explain. However, according to the latest poll, even also because the COVID with a little bit changed the cards on the table, the Partito Democratico has been gaining some support. Right now, it's polling around the 20%, something similar for the Movimento 5 Stelle. So this awkward, I would say, coalition between Movimento 5 Stelle and Partito Democratico, which was really not considered by many analysts as able to survive. Maybe because of the COVID, I don't know the answer, but right now, if you take also other parties like Italia Viva, established by Renzi, Sinistra Italiana, according to the latest poll, they will even be able to win against a radical right or center right coalition, because I would say the coalition formed by the Lega and Fratelli d'Italia right now is no more a center right, because the role of Fratelli d'Italia is really marginal with 6%. Sorry, of Forza Italia, it's very marginal with 6%, even less. So, I mean, perhaps the move was not so bad. But the fact is that, for sure, the Partito Democratico decided to follow the Movimento 5 Stelle on a populist trend. Let's see if it will pay in the future.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Valerio. So, Alessio, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, thank you. I would like just to say a few things. It was really interesting to read the exchange between Cass and Valerio on Twitter about this topic, because I think we can compare it to kind of a political context, really interesting, two different political contexts, which was the first Conte cabinet and the second Conte cabinet, in a sense that we have the same prime minister, but two completely different governments. And as Valerio said, the Partito Democratico was affected by the five-star movements, because the expectation to build a new alliance to form between the five-star movements and the Democratic Party was to manipulate the five-star movements, since basing on the experience of the previous government, since the five-star movement was manipulated by the astonishing capacity of Matteo Salvini to determine the political agenda of the government during the first Conte cabinet. I think that the Democratic Party has failed with this intent. It is more the five-star movement who is manipulating the Democratic Party now, and we can see it now with the next referendum.
Thanks a lot, Alessio. So, kind of on a similar line or a similar tangent, a question that I had next, kind of, not being a specialist in Italy or not knowing a great deal on Italian politics, that I had was about kind of the overall electoral failure or kind of lack of fortunes in the last couple of years for the Italian five-star movement. So why do you think, firstly, that the Italian five-star movement is in electoral decline? And are there any hopes, electorally speaking, for the five-star movement in the future? I mean, do they, for example, do they still have a younger vote base that would stay with them in the future, that could kind of act as a kind of buffer for the party in the future?
So I personally think that the electoral decline that five-star movement is experiencing now is because this movement has failed its experience at the majoritarian party forming an Italian government. What I mean from that is that since the five-star movement started its political journey as a candidate in domestic elections, it has always experienced the watchdog role from the opposition, trying to impact the political agenda of the Italian government. And indeed, when this five-star movement was in the opposition, it has always pushed its political narrative around the ideology of the pure people versus the corrupted elite, by claiming that they were the expression of the general will of the people. However, since it joined the government, and I would like to remember that the Five Star Movement is the majoritarian party, and the Italian Prime Minister is indeed a representative of that movement, it has slowly betrayed some fundamental principles of the party. Like, for instance, the maximum limit of 2 terms to be elected, or the use of the parliamentary immunity, for instance, and many other ideological fights, like passing from a strong Euroscepticism to a soft Euroscepticism, even voting in the European Parliament for the current European Commission. So despite this party was able to collect electoral consent, working from the position, especially from young people, especially people coming from the south of Italy, thanks to all the promises that they were delivering in their political narrative and political agenda. Actually, I think that right now, this party has failed its experience in the government. And I think that the next domestic election will be significant for the future of the party.
Yes, I agree with the points of Alessio. Overall, the Movimento 5 Stelle, let's say, betrayed its electorate. About the future, as I told you earlier, right now it is slowly, let's say, recovering. It's polling around 20%, the Movimento 5 Stelle, so which it is not so bad. Of course, it's very important to consider the possible future role of Giuseppe Conte, the Italian Prime Minister, which is, it's really not clear so far. Of course, as we well know, there was a rally around the flag effect with, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people were, felt, reassured by Conte, even if he had to take, some, very, very unpopular decisions. So I would say it's not, very, very easy to make a forecast concerning the future in Italy. We started this interview talking about, volatility and instability. So it really will depend on the on the fortune of the Movimento 5 Stelle. I mean, they really can have now the possibility to play and to play well these the coming months. The Lega is struggling. Okay, you can say, but Fratelli d'Italia on the other side, it's gaining a lot. But as I told you earlier, right now the two, let's call them the two coalition, the one which is the Movimento 5 Stelle and Partito Democratico, and the other one, the radical right, because it's not more possible to talk about center-right coalition, in my point of view. They're really, at the moment, they're really neck to neck. So, as I said, it really will depend on Conte. It will depend on other consideration, like for example how the pandemic evolves in the future, how Italy reacts to this. Right now, Italy, in comparison to other countries like France, like UK, like Spain, the first months, like March, April, was a very bad situation in Italy. But right now, Italy, in comparison to those countries, is doing well. We don't have the case of COVID-19 as much as in Spain or as in France. So it's all to see, I would say. And let me tell you that it will also depend on the result of the election in the US, in the United States, in the US, because in case of another victory of Trump, this could be a sort of a possibility to galvanize both Fratelli d'Italia and Lega and the party of Salvini. So it also depends on that. We have to see to the other side of the Atlantic. and to wait to November and wait what will happen.
Thanks a lot, Valerio. It's really interesting that you mentioned about, you mentioned the rally around the flag effect that we've seen, within the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, Valerio, both you and I, wrote that piece a couple of months back now for Rant Media, where our main argument was that obviously there's a lot of complexity in terms of whether the far right or the radical right has declined, electorally speaking, at the comparative level. But we do see that radical right parties, particularly the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland party, has seen a reduction in the vote share, and a number of far right parties have seen a reduction in their vote share across Europe here. So clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic has not just had a profound effect on Italian politics, as you were just both mentioning, but also has had a profound effect on European politics as a whole, both in Western Europe, Central Eastern Europe. We saw the so-called enabling law, the enabling act that was put into place by the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán of the Fidesz party. And then we've also seen this play out at the EU level in terms of the European Union Commission level as well, with the EU Council summit that was kind of held recently, that was also kind of a very highly politically charged and volatile occasion. So really briefly, I was just wondering if either of you could just very briefly explain about perhaps the differences in Italy between the North versus the South. Let's say there are some listeners listening in right now. Alessio, you just mentioned about Five Star Movement, for example, getting a large share of voters from the South. I was just wondering, is this still this kind of big historical divide between these two different parts of Italy from a regional perspective? And now the reason why I kind of asked this is that it's quite interesting when we look at some modern kind of populist parties like the AfD party in Germany, which arguably has kind of a more extremist ideological section in Eastern Germany, when you compare it to the more kind of moderate populist radical right party structure and ideology that this type of party has in Western Germany. So just wondering a little bit more, perhaps Alessio or Valerio, what your thoughts are on that.
So yeah, of course, there is a great distinction between the north and the south of Italy in terms of the kind of electorate that we have. There is according to the last elections in 2018, there was a really big support from for the Five Star Movement from the southern regions, because, as I previously said, of the several promises that the Five Star Movement said in their political manifestos, like giving a universal wage according to the citizenship, or other policies in order to redistribute the wealth to the poorest people. In the north, we have a different kind of electorate, more linked to business, to industry, to factory. There is, I would say, also a traditional electorate linked to the League, because we have to remind anyway that the League was previously named as the Northern League. It was a regionalist party. It was a party founded on classical cleavages, and now it has changed. It has developed to a new national perspective. So I would say that the great success in the North was due, first of all, to the kind of electorate they addressed, the right-wing coalition, to the business, liberalism, and of course against immigration. On the other hand, I think that there is a really strong part of the electorate in the north which is still linked to the previous party, regionalist party that was the League, as Northern League.
Yes, I agree. There is still a huge, difference between the northern side of Italy and southern Italy. From Napoli right now, my perspective is in most of young citizens here, or young Italian from southern part of Italy. they harbor a lot of frustration. I know personally many people that had to leave Napoli or other parts of southern Italy to go to north of Italy, or even like abroad to European Union, to Australia, so it's kind of try to find a fortune abroad, and which is very, very sad. But it's always for historical reason it's not something too easy to fix, and it comes a little bit as a surprise that in the last years the Lega, which, as Alessio said, originally was named Lega Nord, had quite a big success in many areas of southern Italy. Right now, according to the latest polls, it seems really in decline here in the south, going like to 3% of support in overall in southern Italy. And anecdotically speaking, the last few times that Salvini came to Napoli, to Castelvolturno, which are areas with a lot of illegal immigrants from Africa, most of the Neapolitans, they completely rejected him. They didn't want him to come and to speak against the possibility to strategically link immigrants with the pandemics, with the possibility to spread the virus. So I would say yes, there is a huge, still a huge divide between the north of the south. The Movimento 5 Stelle tried to capitalize on this, on the frustration. There are many, most of the people of this movimento, right now it's no more a movimento, I would say it's a classical party, the 5 Stelle. Most of the establishment come from the south. If you take, for example, Di Maio, if you take Roberto Fico, they are all from southern Italy. I don't know if in the future the voters from southern Italy, they will give their trust in electoral terms to the Movimento 5 Stelle, but for sure, I mean, they will not give their trust again to Salvini and to Lega.
Thanks a lot, both. That was really fascinating, what you both mentioned about the North versus South divide, and I definitely learned a lot more there. And I think our viewers will also learn a lot more as well. So 2 very difficult questions then to finish off this podcast episode. So the first question for you both is, just again, very briefly, what would be your predictions for the future of populism in Italian politics, let's say after the COVID-19 pandemic is over? And secondly, speaking, again, a very, very difficult question. Can you make any predictions about the upcoming 2020 US presidential election in November between the incumbent President Trump and the challenger, the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden? So for viewers, again, we're recording this episode on the 11th of September, and it appears that Biden is still quite far ahead, or considerably ahead of Trump in the polls. However, recent opinion polls appear to show a slight reduction in support for Biden across a number of states. So I know that this podcast episode is focused much more on Italy as well, but I think it's also quite interesting to perhaps generalize this a little bit, and if you can both make some, perhaps a brief prediction of what you think could happen there. Thank you.
So answering to the first part of this question, according to the literature, basically, I would say that populism tend to survive and develop alongside of the development of crises. It can be a migratory crisis, an economic crisis, or as what we are witnessing nowadays, a pandemic crisis. As such, I would say that it really depends on how the Italian government will handle the pandemic. Despite there is a general disappointment towards the government on how it organized the beginning of the new academic year in school, I think that the pivotal step will be how the Italian government will handle the next moment of crisis. Because I think it will be impossible for the government to prevent new pandemic crises, new waves, or period of lockdowns, But the real challenge for the government will be how much the national health system will sustain the impact of new waves and how much the government will invest into infrastructure that will support Italian lifestyles during the next waves. But again, it's really interesting question because we have to consider also that populism currently is surviving both in the government and in the opposition. So it will really depend which kind of populism will survive after the COVID pandemic. On the one hand, we have the populism as an ideology, people versus elite, and on the other hand, populism as a communicative strategy. Answering the second question regarding the upcoming 2020 US presidential election. I think that if it wasn't for COVID-19, Trump would have really good chance to win the next election. However, I think also that the advent of the COVID has revealed many social and cultural contradictions in American society, and the social tensions emerged by COVID was the detonator of social tensions provoked by institutionalized racism, for instance. However, I think that in this new political context, I think it's quite similar to the previous presidential elections in a sense that the electorate is significantly polarized, and Trump is currently, I think, the most charismatic leader in this competition. So I would even think that the Democrats might win again the popular vote, but we don't know if they will definitely win the presidential election. I can also see that both candidates, they have similar and at the same time antithetic political narratives. On the one hand, Biden is arguing that Trump is a threat for democracy, while Trump claims that Biden will be a threat for law and order, right? But I think that if Biden wants to have more chance to win this election, he should shift his political campaign more about how Trump administration handled the pandemic crisis and talking more about the imminent economic recession.
Yeah, there's a very good point from Alessio. I completely agree. Populism and crisis. When you have crisis, different kind of typology of crisis, it's always a fertile field or frame for populisms to develop. So as concerned Italy, it's very uncertain. It's all to see probably with the economic problems, with frustration rising at the parties like Lega Nord and Fratelli d'Italia, they could have an upper hand on trying to strategically blame on the establishment, the Movimento 5 Stelle, the Partito Democratico, also against the immigrants, like a war between the poor. But also, I would say, as concern crisis, there is not only populist parties or movements to benefit from this. For example, I recently read a very, very interesting article from a professor of the University of Stockholm, Mark Reinhardt, who wrote the classification of the policy making in the European Union. So if it's true that populist parties, they benefit of crisis, it's also true that in terms of output, in terms of policy, effective policies, as concerned the European Union, crisis can also be an opportunity, as we have seen since 2008 with the global financial crisis, then with the euro crisis, with Greece, the Troika, and going on with the migratory crisis till arriving to the COVID-19. So this is a very unique possibility, those crises for populist parties, but also for technocratic actors like the European Union and its institutions. So both of them, they can benefit. As concerned the question regarding the next election, the US, I agree with your point, James. It's complicated to make a forecast. Okay, according to the latest opinion polls, seems that Trump has reduced a little bit, the difference with Biden, but yet also because the U.S. electoral system being very sui generis and complicated, it's not easy at all to make a forecast. I agree again with what Alessio said. If there had not been the COVID-19, I would have bet without any doubts on Trump gaining a second electoral mandate. In this case, I see this more like neck to neck. I don't agree with analysts who say no, Biden it's favorite because of the polls. No, I think it's very as I said, a race on the same level between the two candidates. So there can be a lot of last minute changes. Something that we don't expect right now. It's gonna be very interesting.
Really interesting that both of you mention about populists or kind of populist politicians, populist parties really benefiting from different times of crisis or crises. And we've definitely seen that kind of, Alessio and Valerio, you were kind of mentioning about the refugee crisis from 2015 to 18, perhaps benefited more the populist radical right. And also we saw a so-called mainstreaming effect with a number of perhaps mainstream center-right parties moving more to the right on issues like immigration and socio-cultural issues, and trying to also benefit from this and perhaps mimic the rhetoric of the radical right. Whilst in the 2008 to 2013 economic crisis, perhaps we saw more kind of populist radical left parties benefiting, in Southern Europe. If we think about, at the time, Syriza was seen as a radical left party, or for example, Podemos in Spain, which is very interesting as well. So I think that's kind of nice for listeners to kind of, get their teeth into a little bit, that populists on the right wing and the left wing can benefit from different types of crises. And of course, it's a bit more complicated than I've just made it out to be. I just tried to draw some general trends, kind of patterns or observations there. But again, we have to look at this on a, on a case study basis rather than looking at the overall comparative level picture. But again, it makes me think about some recent studies from very renowned professors in European politics, such as Hans-Peter Krejci from the European University Institute, and also Takis Papas, who's also written on these types of populism and types of crises. So thanks a lot, both Valerio and Alessio, for coming on. Where can viewers find more of your research? Do you have a Twitter account or kind of a website that viewers could find that your latest research at all?
Well, I don't have a Twitter account, unfortunately, but you can follow me on LinkedIn, or there is University of Bristol profile where you can see my research interest and also my latest blog contribution with the Center for Analysis of Radical Right.
I recently discovered, let's say, Twitter only in last February. So I try to keep it updated with the latest research projects, and I find it quite useful to be also in contact with other scholars or analysts. So there, in case somebody's interested, you could find most of the research I try to work on.
Thanks a lot. So thanks to our two fantastic guests today from our Populism Research Unit at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, both Valerio and Alessio. So we're going to be recording more episodes of our Populism Research Unit in the coming weeks ahead, looking at countries such as Germany in the next edition, and then we're kind of going to build on from there. So our Populism Research Unit at CARR, at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, we've got a really wide range of experts that focus on different aspects of the populist radical right and also populism as a whole, like you've seen today from listening to both Valerio and Alessio. So we've got other experts looking at Germany, Italy, France, Norway, the UK, Hungary, Poland, Georgia, and the Ukraine. So all across Europe, which is really important, of course, not to just focus on Western Europe, but also Central Eastern Europe, and also the other regions. Incredibly important when we're looking at these different regional trends and patterns for populism. So finally, our experts, they're really international leading scholars and political commentators on a number of these different Western European and Central Eastern European countries. So thanks a lot to our listeners for tuning in today. See you all soon in the near future. And of course, as always, take care, everybody, during this incredibly difficult time with the COVID-19 pandemic. So take care, everybody, and see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for hosting us, James. It was a pleasure.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you again.